So I think just to lead off really quick is a big thank you for Austin for America for inviting me to talk today. And really just as I talk about that, a little bit of humility that I want to present is fully recognizing that General Rainey was really wanting to talk. So General Rainey is stuck in DC right now doing some really important four-star work. So you didn't get him, you got me. And then I think an invite went out to a guy named General Kane, and he's kind of busy right now too. So you got knocked down a little bit. So hopefully I can deliver and not embarrass myself too much when you put it in that context. I think this event, just listening and looking at the program of what you are all going to talk about and discuss and dialogue through is really important to the Army and the Army Futures Command. Not only of how do we use dual-use tech and how do we bring that on board to the Army, because that is so much of the world we live in now, but how do we engage in a conversation about what is our industrial base and what is the health of our industrial base. With the administration that's coming in now, you're seeing a lot of energy and focus on private equity, VC-backed companies, along with the traditional defense industrial base. And what I'd just offer really quick before I get into my real remarks is, if you're here looking to support the military, the DoD, and I've worked with a number of non-traditional companies, one of the favorite things I used to tell them is, hey, welcome to the defense industrial base. We need you. We need all the ideas, we need all the tech, we need a different way of thinking, and bring that to us. The important part of this isn't necessarily me up here talking about where we're trying to go, but it's the conversation that we need to continue to have. There are a ton of really good ideas, whether it's process ideas or capability ideas, that we need to talk about how we do what we do better, and how do we ultimately provide for the warfighter more responsive and agile capabilities, because that's where the future is going. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but I just wanted to hit that up front of everything I say from here on out is interesting, but that's the important thing, being willing to have those conversations. So with that said, some context and perspective, because my bio is kind of interesting of some of the programs and projects I've led, but I'm a history major undergrad. So I like context and perspective. So why are we where we are today is kind of the question to start with. And I think if you look back to 9/11, I mean, we are a quarter of the way through this century. Where are we today and why, and where are we going? So if you think back to where this century started, 9/11 changed the world. At least that's how I describe it. Really changed our focus. We became laser focused on readiness and addressing immediate needs on a specific type of conflict in Afghanistan and Iraq. And that drove a lot of our decision-making and our investments. And it's easy to look back now and like, well, why the heck did you do that? Why didn't you invest in something else? Well, I also believe in noble intent. Like, nobody wakes up in the morning and say, hey, I'm gonna screw this up as bad as I possibly can, and I wanna go as slow as I can and waste as much money as I can. Nobody does that. But we were responding to the need of the time. And if you follow that through for 20 years, it makes sense to see where we are. We don't have to like it, but it makes sense. I think that's important only from a why are we here? And I much prefer to look through the front windshield than in the rearview mirror of why did we do what we did back then, and where do we need to go now? And I would suggest that, and we're all paying attention to it. In fact, it's great to hear that you've got a Ukrainian UAS driver coming, but it is undeniable that we are seeing a change and a disruption in the land domain right now, whether it's in Gaza or in Ukraine. What I'd caution people about is, as we look at what's going on in the Ukraine in particular, make sure that we understand what are observations that we are learning from, and then what is unique to that conflict and that conflict only, based off of who's fighting it and where they're fighting it. And the Army's spending a lot of, as well as the rest of the joint force, a lot of time analyzing that. I do think that there's absolutely some trends and some lessons, not quite lessons yet, but observations that we can pull from that. Clearly one is the disruption that UASs have created. It's been coming for a while, but we're seeing it in mass in Ukraine. So what does that mean for us going forward? And that's where a lot of the dual use discussion comes forward that you're going to talk about throughout this forum. The other thing that I think is interesting is just the discussion on autonomy and EW, which ties back right back with the UAS conversation that is absolutely going on in Ukraine. And I'll hit some of those comments here in a second about where I think the Army's going. But the Army itself, to put a context on that, and as we talk about what's the Army's role and the purpose of the Army, one, it's the nation's land force, obviously. But beyond that, there's discussion of what is the Army's relevance in a future near-peer conflict. And is the Army super relevant? And a couple of ideas that I would offer as we are working our way with OSD and our joint force partners of what does a near-peer conflict look like with some of our more pressing threats, primarily China and Russia. One, if you think about war, it is a contest of wills, and it's an absolute human endeavor. And humans live on the land. So inevitably, there's going to be a land component to any conflict that we have. How we incorporate the Army into some of those really complex terrains, particularly terrain in the Indo-Pacific, is interesting, but the islands around the Pacific provide some geographical key points and choke points that are going to be really important, I think, in that next conflict. And the Army is pretty well suited to do that. There's the defense of the homeland that's absolutely core to the Army mission as well. And then the last point is, as the Army thinks about what it's moving towards, a phrase that we like to use is, we're the Army and we do windows. And what that means is there's a lot of random mission sets that are presented to the Army to go execute on behalf of our senior leaders and our national leaders. For example, if you want 3,000 soldiers to deploy to the southern border in 3 days, we're your Huckleberry, happy to do it. And we did it. So there's some randomness of how not randomness, but some other aspects of how the Army supports our national leaders that's really important. And each one of those mission sets that I just described briefly, there's absolutely a role for tech. And I'm going to get into that right now because I think that's why most of you here to hear whatever it is that I have to say. As we think about the next conflict against a peer, the couple things that have come and really jumped out from an AFC, Army Futures Command perspective, that are going to be absolutely necessary in that conflict. The first one is about data. The Army an AFC has introduced a new capability we're calling Next Gen C2. And it is essentially the driver for data-centric warfare. The amount of data isn't the problem. It's what we're doing with the data and how we're making decisions. But the idea behind this, the fundamental idea behind Next Gen C2 is being able for commanders to make better, faster decisions than our adversary, because they're going to have access to data too. But how do we empower commanders to make better, faster decisions? Absolutely crucial. If we don't get that right, I would argue that nothing else that we do really matters, because we're going to make decisions after our foe has, and we're going to be behind the loop. So we must get that right. And there's a lot to unpack when you start talking about data and data architectures, APIs. But that is a project that team is working towards and moving rapidly against. That is our number one priority. Underneath that, I think when you start talking about data, it's the AI and autonomy pieces. How are we going to exploit AI capabilities and autonomy in our next fight? Again, that kind of goes back to the data centricity, but I'm separating that slightly because there's command post commander decisions, and then when you think about AI and autonomy usage on unmanned systems, that is another aspect that we are really moving quickly towards. We're calling it human-machine integrated formations, of how do we employ robots, air, ground, maritime, in a formation to maximize and optimize what robots are good at and humans are good at. In that human-machine integrated formations title, the formation is the key portion of that. It's ensuring that we integrate it into a formation and understand what that means. And I'm going to talk about humans in a second, but we can never forget that there's a human somewhere wherever there's tech, and how that human integrates with the tech and the tech integrates with the human is also critically important. Sometimes we lose that aspect. And I'm not taking any questions, but there should be a ton coming at me about IVAS with that. So the other one I'd highlight from a technology perspective that is absolutely makes sense in Austin based off of where a lot of folks are working on is hypersonics. In hypersonics, you've got not only the engine to go really, really, really fast, you got the advanced materials, because physics is a bear when you're going really, really, really fast, and guidance. So it goes where it needs to go while it's going really, really, really fast. That is absolutely a trend that we're seeing, not just that the US is working towards, but our potential adversaries are. But then there's also the counter hypersonics aspect. If everybody has them, how are we going to deal with that, right? That is a huge effort within AFC and the Army, both from an S&T perspective, as well as how we're going to incorporate those capabilities into our formations. And then the last one, which is a little bit different, that I'd like to kind of pose to the audience here, and it's not new, and it's starting to get more and more traction, is the idea of manufacturing at scale. When I was the Bradley PM in Michigan, I read the Arsenal of Democracy book. I don't know if hopefully folks have read that one. Found it pretty fascinating. Arguably, and this is, again, preaching to the choir a little bit, we've lost some of that manufacturing ability in the US. We're starting to see some of it come back. But that is going to be critically important, particularly as we want to take advantage of dual-use technologies or even unique technologies. But the amount of scale that either China, or I'll just talk about China, has is breathtaking. And we've got to be able to compete with that to effectively deter. If they don't see a reasonable and viable manufacturing component within the United States, I don't know if we're really deterring them, frankly. So not only is it if your idea is good, but how does it scale? How do we build it at scale becomes really important without losing, which is sometimes the threat, if you will, or the risk, is without losing the quality or reliability of that widget, whatever it might be. That is one area that is getting more and more traction and discussion within the department, and I think that'll carry through for the next several years. I'm going to come back to one point, though, when I talk about humans. So the tech, and this is coming from an acquisition professional, the tech is kind of interesting. But it's only interesting if it integrates with a human in a formation to deliver an outcome. And oftentimes you get really, really enamored by the individual widget or the tech, absent consideration of the human. So what I want to kind of land with the audience here is, if we're not starting with the human in mind first, whether you want to call it human-centered design, there's a lot of different things. Army calls it soldier-centered design. That's got to be front and center. And I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to address that, because far too often I see us like, hey, that's a really cool thing. Now let's figure out how a human can use it. That may be too late, right? And in the context of a formation. So how do we train it? Is it easy to use? Some of those design principles that we all have become really, really important, particularly when we start thinking about the agility, modularity, and openness that we're really looking for across a lot of our systems to be able to adapt over time. And that is one of those other key trends that we're seeing from Ukraine, is their spin cycle is not measured in months, it's measured in weeks. So how do you do that across an army that's geographically dispersed in a contested environment? Well, man, it's got to be open, it's got to be agile, it's got to be modular. And the conversation that we really want to have with industry is, I think we can all say, yeah, those principles make sense. How do you do that for an army? And what are the things that the army, the government, needs to control from an interface perspective, and what do we not? And stay out of the way. But realize that we can't give agency only to a specific vendor, because we also don't want vendor lock. We're kind of a capitalist too. We like competition, and vendor lock seriously inhibits that. So how do we create that, and how do we have that discussion with industry to help keep us informed? And you need to be honest with this, right? Because some of the tendencies is like, ooh, I could capture this whole market. Well, I would say, let's look at what's good for the gander. May not necessarily be good for the goose, but think about the gander here in the Army. How AFC is also looking at that exchange of ideas with industry is something that we're calling the characteristics of needs. So there's a lot written about how the services produce requirements documents, which tells us what to go buy. One of the newer ideas that the Army has introduced is a characteristics of need. And the way we describe it is our first attempt, with all humility, to communicate with industry on a really hard problem, usually a systems of systems problem. And we want industry's feedback. We humbly know we don't have it right, but we want you to help us get it closer to right before we actually start writing requirements and start spending a lot of money against it. So from an industry standpoint, it's an opportunity to get in early to understand where the Army's headed and to help not really necessarily shape, but inform. We've done that with Next Gen C2. We're doing one on autonomy right now. And we encourage industry's feedback because, again, we know we don't have it right, and we want to iterate with industry and the U.S. Army, for that matter, on this characteristics of need over time. So we really need your feedback. And again, this is somewhat unique and new. Usually we kind of go into our little conclave and write a requirement and come out and like, hey, we got this right. And so this is a huge step of humility on the Army, frankly. Say, hey, we don't know everything. Let's get the best minds in the country to give us feedback. Now, based off of that, if we get 10,000 pieces of feedback, there's going to be some that contradict, and not everybody's feedback is going to be accepted. So just have that understanding, but appreciate the opportunity is what I would offer. Because again, we haven't done this very often, and I'm really excited about this approach. The other thing we're talking about is being far less prescriptive in our requirements and being far more descriptive, right? And making sure that we open up the trade space as wide as we possibly can within reason. There's got to be some left and right limits for industry to come up with innovative and novel ideas to solve a particular problem, which will require iteration. So those are all things that we're thinking about from Army Futures Command now to kind of set the stage for some of this adaptability and agility that I've been talking about. Okay, I'm going to wrap up with a couple of other thoughts, just two last thoughts. First is help the Army be a better buyer. There are times where the Army can get kind of siloed into a path. This is the only path. Have the conversation with us of how we can be a better buyer. The Army does not develop software very well. Probably shouldn't be doing it at all. We don't necessarily buy software the best either, as an example. Help us be a better buyer, but understand our uniqueness and our kind of some of the constraints that we operate under, and understand scale and what that looks like for the Army. But help us be a better buyer. I encourage industry in every job I've had, have helped me be better with what I do. I don't have all the answers. And sometimes I won't like your suggestion. I'll tell you I don't like it. And then we can still have a conversation. But that's part of the open dialogue that was mentioned in the leading comments. We need to continue to have it. And the last thing is, really to get off the stage, is this is your Army. This is the nation's Army. It's not mine. I'm part of it. But this is yours. And if you think about it in that context and the importance of national security and what your Army can do, help us get there. And I encourage you to engage as often as you can. We don't turn people away from a conversation. Resources are resources, though. But we need to keep the conversation going. That's the only way we're going to progress with new ideas and new ways of thinking about how we can deter, and if not deter, defeat a near peer in the future. Okay, with that, I appreciate everybody's time. Your agenda is really cool. I'd love to stay all day. I can't. And hopefully I lived up to some level of expectation given who was supposed to be here and wasn't. And not too many laughs today, but that's okay. I think everybody stayed awake, so I think I delivered on my at least initial portion of the warm-up act for really what follows the rest of the day. So with that, thank you for what you do, and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.